From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters. Ontario Soccer is launching a pilot project where some referees will be wearing body cameras this summer in order to police abuse against the officials. What's even more surprising about this is the age groups it will be used on. The first games will be in the under 9 and under 11 age groups. So we're not talking about European soccer hooligans. These are parents, spectators, and coaches who are criticizing and hurling abuse at officials, who, for many of these games, are teenagers. This feels extreme, but soccer is not the only sport that's dealing with these issues. And one of the results is that there are less people wanting to officiate these sports. Kerry Gillespie is a sports reporter at the Star and is here to talk about the body cam pilot project and how some sports are dealing with a lack of officials due to abuse. Kerry, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Kerry, reading your story, we got to start off with just sort of the nuttiest thing off the top. Basically, that referees are going to be wearing body cameras, but also the fact that they're going to be wearing body cameras to police behavior not on the pitch, but on the sidelines. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, and what was your initial reaction?
Well, when I started the story, I was looking into the shortage of officials across a variety of sports and what those federations were doing to fix the problem. So I was not expecting to hear that Ontario Soccer was about to launch a pilot project putting body cameras on referees. And I was super surprised to hear that it was going to happen at games for such young players.
Yeah, to be clear, what leagues are we talking about?
So it's a pilot project. And things are still, it isn't finalized yet. It starts in June, but we're talking sort of the U9, under 9 and under 11 age groups. So these are young recreational leagues. These are not elite competition by any means.
And basically, the big reason is because of the abuse that refs are facing at this level, right? And across the board, really.
Yeah, referee abuse is, in Canada, I guess we've long known about the problem of some hockey parents and coaches shouting at refs. So I suppose we shouldn't really be surprised to find that there are similar problems in sports as popular as soccer.
So how did we get here? Like, what was the thinking that this would be, I guess, the deterrent? Is it a name and shame type of thing?
Well, I guess a couple things have happened. Referee abuse, which can be anything from verbal up to physical, it's not a new problem. But everyone that I spoke to for this story said that things are worse coming out of the pandemic, that people have somehow forgotten how to behave in social settings and that they're less patient than they used to be, that they're taking that out on referees. And sports like Ontario Soccer, they've basically just gotten to the point where they think that the steps that they've taken so far haven't made enough change. And we're in a society where police record interactions with the public, so that deters people probably from saying things they might otherwise say. And then if people do something, then you have a record of it. So I think the hope is that it may make people think twice about something that they were going to say or do. And then if people still do something, then it's easier to hold those people to account when you've got a record of it.
Did you talk to any refs who've experienced this type of abuse firsthand?
I did. So I talked to one ref who still remembers kind of how awful he felt when he was taunted by a parent coach. And this was at a youth game. And the parent coach was shouting at him and calling him Four Eyes for wearing glasses and suggesting he was blind because he couldn't see what was happening on the pitch. And he was 15 years old at the time. And this was his first year of refereeing. And he said he felt alone, he felt isolated, and he wondered whether he should be doing the job at all.
I think that that's something that, is an interesting point too, because at that level, it is a lot of kids who are actually refereeing other kids and they're still getting abused by the parents. Like, that sounds kind of nuts, right?
Yeah, very much so. And this referee, who's now 21, made that point saying that parents generally should have empathy for children. They have empathy for their own children. And they need to remember that the referees at these grassroots games are often very young. So they're not pro refs. This is a part-time gig.
We're not talking about Kerry Fraser here. Right. Obviously, this is probably leading people to stop being referees and quitting over it. Do we have any thought about that? Any numbers of people reporting that happening?
Yeah, it's definitely happening. It's a bit hard to quantify how widespread the abuse itself is because those abuse cases are handled sort of at the district level. So that's the Toronto Soccer Association or York or Durham. And the official process for making an abuse complaint is quite involved. And so a lot of refs are not bothering, especially if it's verbal abuse. They're not bothering to go through that process. So we don't have a great statistics on the scope of the abuse, but we have quite good statistics on what's happening on the other end when refs are quitting. So there have been numerous surveys and studies in soccer and other sports, and abuse is always cited as one of the top factors for refs quitting. And the fear of abuse is also cited as a factor for not wanting to take on the job. And I've been told that there are cases where brand new refs have worked a single game, faced verbal harassment and bullying from parents or a coach on the sideline, and they've quit right then. They've never come back. And we have overall statistics as well.
I want to talk about that because I thought some of the numbers in your story were super fascinating. And let's move this off soccer because, as you said, you started looking at a number of sports. So what are we finding out? I mean, I think lacrosse was mentioned in your piece as well. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the issues that other sports are also facing in terms of retaining officials and officiators, I guess?
Well, so across the board, I mean, we're losing thousands of referees. So the soccer numbers they had 8,000 referees in 2019. So that's sort of the last year before the pandemic. And now they're down to below 5,000. Hockey dropped from 7,500 to less than 5,500. And, football dropped from 800 all the way down to 500. And they're back to 7. Lacrosse has about 650, which is the number that they need, but most of them are brand new. So they have problems with retaining officials, and that creates problems for running games when all your officials are new.
Well, these are really, really big drops. I mean, obviously, what does it mean for the players on the field?
Well, this comes back to, I guess, the broader point of the story, which was the shortage of officials that's impacting sports. And in some cases, it's leading to canceled games. Already, sports are changing how they run games to try to deal with the shortage. So soccer runs matches with one referee instead of 3, which creates other problems and is a big ask for one referee to cover a field. Lacrosse has changed the way games are scheduled to make the most of their pool of officials. You can't schedule one game. You have to have sort of 3 back-to-back games so they can bring in one set of officials to work the games. So, I mean, sports are trying to come up with workarounds, but they're struggling to keep up with just too few officials.
I think, the abuse issue is obviously big, but you mentioned something else, the idea of the pandemic. What are the things that the pandemic is sort of being blamed for in terms of less officials participating?
Yeah, I mean, the COVID pandemic affected so many aspects of all of our lives. And that's definitely one of the factors in the shortage. All these sport leaders are saying they were facing shortages before the pandemic, but the pandemic made things much worse, much faster. So what happened was a lot of refs who suddenly found themselves not working because the pandemic shut down so much of community sport for so long. When sport came back, they just decided not to come back. So for some of them, that was a good time to retire. They'd found something else to do with their time, or some of them didn't really relish the idea of coming back and maybe getting yelled at on the field. They'd moved on from it. So that's one of the factors at play for sure.
We'll be right back. Okay. I guess the question here is just, what are sports federations doing? What are they doing to improve conditions and I guess also recruit new referees?
So there's definitely work underway in many sports to expand recruitment efforts to find new officials. So lacrosse has reached out and done sort of women-only clinics and referee clinics in Indigenous communities to kind of bring in a new pool of referees. Football is doing a kind of a zebras campaign where they're reaching out to people who have, long loved football, but just never thought about being a ref, saying, we are an official, we need you, come save your sport in another way. So there's quite a lot of recruitment that's going on. And On the sort of retention side, there's kind of no ref, no game campaigns that are sort of really trying to urge players, spectators, parents, coaches to be kind, respectful to everyone in the game. And that's not just players, but that's also match officials. And there are numerous anti-bullying, harassment, abuse policies. And a lot of those policies are longstanding. But I think as the match official crisis is growing, the need for those policies to be taken seriously seems to be becoming better understood.
I mean, obviously these body cameras are going to be one way to bring sort of accountability to the field. Any idea what the reaction was like to that? I mean, people like saying this is a good idea or bad, or is it too early to say?
Well, given that the pilot hasn't started yet, some of it is too early to say, and I don't know how parents are going to react to this. That will be interesting to go to these games and see what happens. But for sure, the sport officials at the district level and the club level and referees seem to be welcoming it. And one person I spoke to said that the crisis has been going on for quite a while, but people just don't really think that much about it. And that this is one way. This is kind of a bold move that's going to draw some attention. So even if the cameras it's a pilot, so they're not going to be everywhere. But the hope is that it'll make people realize, things have gone too far if this is the step we're having to take.
Well, we will actually see and hear what's being said to some of these poor guys, the zebras. Okay, the difficult thing about this is arguing about officiating is a part of sports culture. I think the problem might be is how passionate people are about sports, and in particular, their kids and youth sports. But now we're criticizing the labor of these referees. How do we change the culture around referees?
Well, for sure. I mean, there's long been a sports culture that thinks shouting at the ref is just part of the game. That's a fun part of the game. And I think more sports like Ontario Soccer are saying, enough is enough. The soccer pitch is the workplace for referees, and it's not acceptable to verbally abuse people in other places, for doing their job. You don't shout at the person who gives you coffee because they gave you the wrong kind of milk, or your colleagues in your workplaces. And I think they're just sort of saying, as we understand more about sort of safe sport around athletes, that sport needs to be safe for everyone. And this idea that we shout at the refs, it's not cool anymore. I mean, it was probably never cool, but it's becoming culturally unacceptable. Or these associations are trying to make it culturally unacceptable. But I mean, changing a cultural norm it's hard work. It takes time. None of this is easy.
What do you think is at stake if amateur sports federations can't figure this out and improve the conditions of referees?
Well, I think quite a lot is at stake because many of these sports are growing in popularity. But if they don't have enough refs to meet the current demand, they're not going to be able to expand their clubs and leagues to reach all the kids and adults that want to play. So, I mean, just look at football now. They have about a quarter of the officials that they need for flag football, which is like quite a fast growing discipline of that sport. Ontario Soccer has 5,000 refs, but to actually meet the demand that it says is out there, it needs 12,000. It's a huge jump, and they're never going to achieve that if they're constantly battling concerns with ref abuse and struggling to recruit and retain.
Okay, it seems like a really big problem, and obviously a number of factors into it. And I was kind of shocked to see how fewer refs there are in these sports compared to how much there was previously. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know?
Well, we did talk about it, but one thing I think is sort of worth highlighting again is that these referees that work at these grassroots youth games are generally young themselves. So these are 14, 15, 16 years old, and sometimes even younger. And this is probably their first job. It's a part-time job. And just like the kids on the field are learning to play at this stage, these young people are also learning to referee, which I guess to me just adds to the importance of showing them, kindness and respect and not copying any of the behaviors that people see while they're watching pro sports from their couch.
That's a great point, Kerry. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Kerry Gillespie is a sports reporter at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudhar. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.